Assalamu alaikum. Today is our 10th lecture of Global Business Management. The learning objectives are as follows. Understand the cost and benefit of FDI for home country. To understand the costs and benefit of FDI for host country. And the third objective is to understand the government policy instruments and FDI. And the fourth objective is what is the implication for business. Okay, before we start today's lecture, we are going to do the quick recap of the last lecture. In the last lecture, we have done about the FDI, and we have discussed this thing that why scholars are trying to explain why firms try to undertake the investment, undertake the FDI at about the same time and the same location. Mean firms go to certain countries, same time and same location. This is the problem, that why firms try to do that. In order to explain, in order to answer this question, the first scholar, Knickerbocker, try to explain this concept of firms' behavior. He suggests that firms follow their domestic competitor overseas. And FDI flows are a reflection of strategic rivalry between firms in a global marketplace, more pertinent in oligopolistic market. He's trying to explain this thing that firms who are trying to, they are following their rival firms. If the rival firm is going to certain location, that firm is going to do the same thing. They are going to replicate their move, strategic move. Why they are trying to do that? In a way, they are saying, he explained this thing that if, for instance, the firm A of USA is going to went to China, the firm B and C is going to replicate their move, replicate the move of the firm A, because the company B and C will consider this thing that might be firm A will succeed in China, and they are going to generate the sufficient capital, extra money, and that money can be used to capitalize to get the more market share in USA, rather than providing the firm A the opportunity to make the extra money and use that money against company B and C. Why not those company B and C go to the China at the same time in the same market and try to stop firm A from making the extra money, and they are going to provide the competition, same level of competition, but they're providing in USA, they're providing the same level of competition in China as well. This is the basic concept, and the important thing is this sort of pattern is more visible in oligopolistic markets. And we have seen this sort of behavior of Toyota and Nissan responded to investment of Honda. And when Honda went to the European market, Toyota and Nissan replicated the move of Honda, and they went to the Europe as well. And similarly, Electrolux, when Electrolux moved out from the Swedish market, why they did so? The Electrolux followed the global General Electronics and Whirlpool. They followed the pattern of GE and Whirlpool, and that's why they followed that move, and they went outside the domestic market. The next guy who tried to explain the FDI pattern was the Vernon. We had already discussed this lecture last time, that Vernon is the life cycle of product. This is the theory of life cycle of product. Life cycle of product means that with the passage of time, as the product matures, the sale location and the production location of the production location changes. For instance, the example of the Xerox company who produced the photocopier machine. The Xerox invented the photocopier machine in 1960s, and first they started their production only in USA and catered the US market and exported the products to the European market. Subsequently, when they observed the the production demand, the demand of the product is higher in the European, they open their production unit in Europe, and after some time the European company learned that technology and they started to produce their own photocopier machine in Europe. And this process goes on further from Europe to developing countries. With the passage of time, as the product grows, as the product matures, the production, the demand or sale of that location of sale, or the market of that product move from USA to Europe to developing countries, and later on, what happened? The production is moved from USA to developing countries, and USA was, rather than producing that stuff in USA, they were better off in exporting that product from developing countries to USA. This is the life cycle of the products, but this theory is failed when this theory couldn't explain why firms adopt the FDI. Rather, like if we continue the example of Xerox, we can see this thing that when the Xerox observed that production is higher in demand is higher in European countries, then why couldn't they just export that product in the Europe? Why they had to do the FDI in Europe? Important concept is this theory is forgetting the concept of economy of scale. If the demand of the product was higher, they could increase the level of production, and in that way they could reduce the overall cost of the production, and on the basis of the economy of scale concept. The next philosopher who tried to explain the pattern of foreign direct investment was John Dunning, who belonged to University of Reading, UK. His theory was focused on the location advantages and location specific advantages. According to this theory, he was suggesting that there are certain advantages which are only specific to the location. For instance, these advantages can be the natural resources advantages, like resources only associated like the oil and gas, minerals, they are only fixed with that location, or certain advantages like cheap labor advantages, cheap resources advantage. These are also associated with those markets, with those locations. If firm is willing to avail the cheap labor resources, they have to go to the China or India. If the firm is willing to avail the advantages of natural resources, for instance oil and gas, they have to go to the Gulf countries. Similarly, if they want to learn the technology somewhere, and then they have to go to the Silicon Valley of Los Angeles, of California. Another aspect, the factor which was important in the locations of the Dunning electric paradigm was the externalities. Externalities mean spillovers. Spillovers mean that firms, when they operate, when they go outside the country, the technology, the know-how, the management skills, or the way how the multinational companies manage processes, these things spill over from that company, from that multinational company to domestic firms as well. Domestic firms learns from that multinational companies how these sort different skills, and like we have discussed this example of this US company RCA, who invented the color television in USA. They licensed their production in Japan to Sony, and what happened, the Sony later on learned this technology, the same technology, and they started to produce their television by their own. This is called a spillover effect. How does a government, this spillover effect, next point was that we had discussed was that how does a government's attitude affects FDI? There are three sort of attitudes of the government. The first one was the radical attitude, radical view. Radical view thinks that that traces back to the Marxist political and economic theory, and the radical view thinks that this FDI, this foreign direct investment, is an instrument of imperial capitalism. Through this multinational companies, these capitalist countries who are mainly representing the USA and the European countries, these multinational companies try to control the local economy, try to control the economy, the technology, the employment, these sort of things they control, and ultimately they control the whole economy of that country. And the benefit of capitalist imperialist home country and socialist and nationalist, there is one distinction. They were doing these things, the nationalist and socialist. Nationalist examples are, the socialist example are, for instance, China, Russia, Cuba, North Korea, and the nationalist countries are the Iran and the India. But with the passage of time, what we are observing nowadays is that this philosophical thought, this view is changing with the passage of time. Because of this globalization element, these philosophers of the countries who are following this sort of philosophy, they are changing their view from radical to less strict view. Next point was the next philosophy who sees the FDI was the free market perspective, which is mainly driven in the USA and the European countries, the capitalist countries. They argue that the firms do the international business without any intervention. There should not be any government intervention in the movement of any trade. This perspective suggests that the companies should specialize in the production of the goods they can produce most efficiently and trade for everything else. It then follows that FDI will actually increase the overall efficiency of the global economy, not fully embraced. Not fully embraced means, despite that these countries are claiming that there should be a free market economy, but beside this sort of claims, these countries have not fully embraced the free market perspective. Free market perspective means still, for instance, we have discussed the example of US air industry. In US air industry, the government did not allow foreign direct investment more than 25%. Similarly, in news broadcasting industry, it's not allowed for foreign multinational firms to invest in newscasting or communication industry. In between these two extremes, radical and free market perspective, there is a third perspective, which is a pragmatic nationalism. Pragmatic approach considers both the positives and negative aspects of this FDI, and it emphasizes on the comparing the positives and negative aspects of both FDI, and if the positive aspects, the benefits outweigh the cost of FDI, then the country has to undertake those investments. Otherwise, they have to reject that investments. Pragmatic nationalism suggests that FDI should not only be allowed if the benefit outweigh the outweighed cost. Okay, how does FDI benefit the host country? This is the main important thing. Host country transfer effects, we are actually already talked about a bit about it. Remember that FDI can benefit a country by bringing in capital, technology, management skills, helping the country to increase its economic growth. This is the first advantage that firm is getting. The host country, we are talking about the host country's advantage. Host country, we mean when firm is going, for instance, a US firm is going into China, China will be considered as the host country, and the US firm will be considered as the home country. The first advantage the host country is going to get is the resource advantage, resource transfer effect. Resource transfer effect means these firms are going to get, like Chinese firms, Chinese country, China, when the US firms are going to China, what are the advantages in terms of resources? Of course, China will be benefited with the capital. First of all, the capital will flow from USA to China. The next one is technology. The Chinese market or Chinese companies are going to learn a new technology. because of USA, that company, and the management skills, the new management higher or more skilled, more efficient management skill will be present because of this multinational company in China. The next point is the bringing jobs. The well-cited example, this is the second point. The multinational companies bring the jobs into the foreign countries. In the bringing the job, they are trying to get the job in two ways. One is the first direct way. In the direct way, they are providing the job in the host country, like when they start the FDI, they employ a lot of local people. The negative, the indirect way is, of course, when they started build some production facility in China. We continue the example of US and China. For instance, if they are doing this thing, of course, their production facility is going to use some distribution channel, some marketing channel, some suppliers as well. All these different elements, different entities of the supply chain, there will be new jobs for them as well. There will be some job will arise in the distribution, in the marketing, in the supply, in this sort of thing. There will be indirect job which is associated with that multinational company. A famous example is many people in Middle Tennessee are employed at Nissan facility. When Japanese automobile company, they opened their production facility in Tennessee, a lot of people were employed there. And because Nissan workers need houses to live in, grocery stores, schools, a host of other jobs have been created as well. Okay. Keep in mind, of course, that some of these jobs will be cancelled out by the loss of jobs in Detroit that will occur when the US consumers buy Nissan instead of Fords. That's a very important thing. Like if we talk the example of metro that we have here in Islamabad, metro cash and carry. Because of this is a German company, and with the collaboration of Pakistani company, they have initially for 3, 4, 5 years they were solely operated by the German company, but now they are in collaboration with the Pakistani company. But important thing is, when that company entered in this market, a lot of jobs created in this store because of this store. But like this example is stating that this jobs can be at the cost of, might be because this metro is getting a lot of sale. Who are those people who are buying this, buying from the metro? People who were buying before from some other stores, like in some other stores were close in the markets, I-10 or some local stores. And because there are people starting to buy from the metro, they stop buying from these small shops. And because their level of sale reduced in small shops, might be there are a lot of people who are laid off because of less sale and less growth. In that way, we can say that metro's job is at the cost of a lot of jobs at the small stores. In that way, we can understand this example. Okay, the next benefit, the third benefit of host countries in the host country of FDI is the balance of payment effect. Balance of payment is basically, if we talk about the in terms of terminology, balance of payment is a record of a company's payment to and receipt from other countries. This is the next term is the current account. Current account is the country's export and imports of goods and services. Every country wants to have more exports and less imports. When they have the more export, there will be a positive impact. More export, positive impact. More import, negative impact. FDI helps balance of payment in two ways. The first of all, FDI is substitute for import of goods. Okay, it increases the current account, for instance. Okay, for instance, in Japanese FDI in EU, what the Japanese were doing. Like what was happening that before USA was importing the cars or spare parts from Japan to USA. Importing mean in balance, in current account it was crediting. It was, when they import, it was a negative thing is was going on from the country, or we can say that it was a credit is written in the balance of payment. Rather than importing that stuff, what they did, when Japan did the Japanese companies, Toyota, Nissan, they did the FDI in USA. What happened? All those products, all those cars or automobile spare parts, what USA was importing from Japan, what's happening with that? They are getting within the USA. Mean they stop importing the product. What happened? Mean Japanese companies are producing those spare parts and those cars within USA. That's a big thing. Means they stopped importing, and it's a positive impact on balance of payment. And the second thing is, when multinational companies, like we continue with the example of the USA in automobile industry, this is the first thing that happened, that USA stopped importing. This is a good thing with the current account. And the next step, the Japanese automobile industry who are operating in the Nissan and Toyota, who are in the USA, they were also they were selling within the USA, and they were also selling in some other market like Canada and Mexico. Of course, because of this selling thing, there were export happening from USA to Canada and Mexico. Because of this thing, mean in the first step import was reduced, and in the second step export was increased. In that way, we can say FDI impact in two ways. Okay, the last effect is of FDI on the host country is the FDI affect competition and economic growth. The first one is the competition. How FDI affect on competition? First of all, when the multinational companies enter in a domestic market, it gives the competition a higher competition to the domestic market. This is the first thing. And the second thing is, and what is the advantage of this thing because of competition? Like we have already discussed this concept, that because of this competition, the domestic market is going to strive hard to sustain their position within the domestic market. Like if that because of this competition, they have to concentrate more on their quality. They have to concentrate more on their production, their facilities, their services. All these as elements, they have to concentrate more, and they are going to invest more if they are operating in such industry where the innovation is important. Then that means that these domestic companies are going to invest more on the R&D facilities, R&D functions, and they are trying to invent something more extra, to try to bring something unique aspect in their product. In that way, we can say that technological efficiency will be increased because of this competition. And overall, all this thing will eventually affect positively on the economic growth. Economic growth means people are getting job. It affects on the positively on the economic growth. If competition increased, people are getting more choices, less cost, better innovative products, high technology. All goes positively for the economic growth. It affects positively on the balance increases balance of payments. Its effects on the economic growth. All these things are directly and indirectly effects on economic growth. This should drive down the price and benefit customer. More competition also promotes increased productivity, innovation, and then economic growth, as we have already discussed. We have seen huge improvement in world telecommunication, for example, since 1997 WTO agreement to liberalize the internet. The important thing, we have seen this thing that the telecom industry, because of this telecom this competition, like we have discussed this thing that the Ericsson in the Sweden and the Nokia in Finland, because of a huge competition within the market, these companies were forced to bring something new. They invent something new, and that's why the huge improvements in telecommunication has been observed around the world. Okay, these were the benefits that we have seen for the host country. Now there are some disadvantages, there are some costs associated with FDI for host country as well. What are their costs? There are three main costs involved with inward FDI. The first one is adverse effect on the competition. We had discussed the positive element of the competition, that increases the technology innovation and the low price and high quality. This sort of things are the positive impact. But the negative impact is, because of this high competition, might be domestic firm cannot compete with the multinational companies. Multinational companies, for instance, if that multinational company is a subsidiary of a really huge big firm, a foreign firm, for instance, if a foreign entity or some subsidiary entered in the Pakistani market, and that firm belongs to some US firm, of course that firm, that subsidiary have better technology, they can get extra credit money, they have more financial resources, because of first of all they belong to the foreign market, secondly their parent firm is really big and high resources, they can be high technological firm, and because of these elements the domestic firm will not be able to compete with that multinational firm. And because of this competition, the domestic firm might go out from the market. This concept is called crowding out effect. The second things, for instance, if for multinational enterprises, multinational company sports its subsidiary, when it becomes established in the host market, it might be stronger than the indigenous company and could drive the local company out of the business. Host governments, particularly those of the developing countries, worry. This is the point of special concern for the developing countries, because they think that the domestic market, the companies or their own companies, the indigenous companies operating in the domestic market, might be they are not well equipped, they don't have the great technology, they don't have the better human resources or managerial skills, or they don't have that much of intense capital through which they can compete with the multinational companies. These in developing countries, they have to take care of their infant industries which is not fully on their feet and fully standing on their feet, and might be when the multinational company entered, who are matured enough, they will immediately kill that infant industry and they will capture that thing. The second point, that the cost for host country is the balance of payment, negative effects on balance of payment. When it comes to the balance of payment, host countries worry that along with the capital inflow that come with the FDI will be the capital outflow. Along with the capital inflows that come with the FDI will be the capital outflow that occurs when the subsidiary repatriate profit to the parent company. Some countries actually limit the amount of profit that can be repatriated to limit the negative. Okay, what does it mean? The first point. In the first point, the countries are more concerned when company, of course, when FDI's people, we have seen the positive element of capital inflow. Company is coming into the country, of course that company is bringing the huge capital. That's the capital inflow. But what about the profit, whatever that company is making, and that profit goes back to that parent firm, go back to that home country. For instance, that USA's company is operating in Pakistan, of course that company, whatever they are making in Pakistan, the huge profit is going back to the USA, might be to the parent firm, and that will be considered as a negative aspect for that. This is the negative aspects on the balance of payment, capital outflow is going on. Okay, host countries are, and there are some countries who tried, when they do the FDI, they agree the FDI activity, the governments try to limit the amount of capital outflow from the country. Host country are also concerned about that some subsidiaries import a substantial number of their inputs. The second aspect that are really significant and that significantly affect on balance of payment is when a firm enter, like we have discussed this example. Japanese automobile industry, they invested their capital in the USA in late 80s and 70s, and at that time the concern was how initially we can say that this will affect positively on balance of payment for the USA, but what about the situation if Japanese companies started to import more their spare parts from Japan? That will be a huge import for USA. Import is not good for the USA for the balance of payment. And rather than they are getting that spare parts from the US industry, from the US auto spare parts manufacturer. If they import that product from back home, what's going to happen? Of course, that will affect negatively on the balance of payment of the USA. And pledging to buy the more. And the second thing, there is one more element that when there is for the host country, there is, if that company exactly like that their Japanese companies are importing more spare parts, they can do that. They can hire more people, from Japanese people, and they bring people from at the managerial posts with the big perks, with the big salaries, bonuses. They can bring those managerial executives from Japan. Of course, they are paying big money to them, and it will cost negatively on the balance of payment on USA as well. The third point is the third negative aspect of FDI on host country is the loss of national sovereignty and autonomy. Sometimes host countries worry that they may lose some economic independence as a result of FDI. They worry that since foreign companies have no particular commitment to the host country, they wouldn't really worry about the consequences of their decisions on the host country. Loss of economic independence. This is an important element that countries are worried about because of this FDI. These countries think that if they are if they allow the foreign direct investment to enter in that market, might be these countries, these economies will lose the economic independence. They will be we have discussed the radical point of view, that they believe that that multinational company will capture the technology, they will capture the capital, they will capture the employment, and eventually they will be in such strong position that they are going to negotiate with the government. Government has to negotiate with the company because of their strong position. In a way, we can say that the government will lose the economic independence against these multinational companies. However, the Robert Reich, a former member of the Clinton cabinet, notes that this is a really outdated thinking. In today's interdependent economy, no company maintains strong loyalty to one country. They are saying what this guy is proposing is that you cannot demand the loyalty from the multinational company. Multinational company is interdependent. Their benefit, their interests are interdependent across the markets, and they have to go and operate all over the market, all over the countries, and they cannot be loyal just with the one country. This is the postulation of Robert Reich. Okay, these were the costs of a host country. Now we are going to talk about what are the benefits and costs of home country. First we start with the benefit of the home country. The first benefit of the home country is the effect on the capital account of the home country's balance of payment from the inward flow of foreign earnings. What you mean by how you are going to explain this thing? We have seen that the Japanese are investing in USA. Of course, this is the positive thing, and positive inflow is coming into the USA. and affect positively on the balance of payment of the US. How it can affect the positively on the balance of payment of Japan? In fact, it should be affect negatively, because the it's a capital outflow for the Japan. What you say? You can think in that way, that when they are making profit in USA, the Japanese companies, of course they are going to pay back this profit to their headquarters, which are located in Japan. That in that sense, money is coming back to the Japan from USA, and that will be considered as a positive inflow for Japan. The second one is employment effect that arise from the outward FDI when importing parts. Like we have discussed this thing, imagine a scenario when Japanese automobile industry is importing the products from Japan to produce the cars in USA. That will affect, of course, positively on the Japanese economy, because that will be a more automobile spare part industry will flourish, and there will be more job, and there will be more factories, and there will be more demand of those spare parts, and automatically there will be a more job. The third point is gains from learning valuable skills from foreign market that can subsequently be transferred back to the home country. Reverse resource transfer. And the GM and Isuzu and the Ford and Mazda in Japan, like they are saying this, the opposite example, like when GM General Motors entered in Japan with the collaboration of Isuzu. What happened? Because Japanese, they were at the top back then in the automobile industry, and US firms want to learn that technology. To learn that technology, what they did the FDI with Isuzu in Japan, and they were operating there in Japan, and subsequently what they did, the management of that people of General Electric who were working in Japan, they went back to the USA, and they transferred that technology from Japan to USA. This is called reverse transfer, reverse resource transfer. And similarly, it happened with the Ford and Mazda. Ford was the US firm, and the Mazda is the Japanese firm, and the Ford went to Japan with collaboration of Mazda, and they learned the technology from Mazda and transferred that technology in reverse order from Japan to USA. Okay, now we are going to see the element, what are the cost of FDI to the home country. Home country balance of payment can suffer. This is the first point, that the home country's balance of payment can be influenced. The first one is from the initial capital outflow required to fund. Like we have discussed this thing, that when the Japanese companies were going from Japan to USA to invest, to undertake the FDI there, of course that there initially that was a capital outflow for Japan. Rather than these firms were operating in Japan, Japanese firm operate in Japan, they were doing business in USA. That means that was a capital outflow for Japan, and that affects negatively for a home country. The next point was if the purpose of the FDI is to serve the home market from a low cost labor, that's another aspect. And if the FDI is a substitute for direct export, that's the next point, is that if there's intention of those firms is to just do the export, what's going to happen? They are doing the export, they are replacing the export with the foreign direct investment, and that will be the next point. Employment may also be negatively affected if the FDI is a substitute for domestic production. If the firm is going out just for the sake of doing the FDI, of course that's a negative aspect for the home country, that employment is moving away from that country to the home country to the host country. Okay, but international trade theory suggests that home country concerns about the negative economic effects of offshore production may not be valid. It is actually be freeing up resources that could be international trade theory is not buying this arguments. What the international trade theory is suggesting, international trade theory is saying, in fact, when a company moves its capital from domestic market to the foreign market, what it's in fact doing, it frees up the resources which can be utilized in domestic market for other reasons as well. They can use for other purposes as well, and more efficient purposes. In that way, you cannot say this thing that this is just a capital flight is just a negative thing for the host country or for the home country. Okay, now we can say that various home countries can encourage. How does government influence FDI? This is the important thing. Before we have seen the positive and negative aspect for both the home and host country, now we will talk about the how government policies or government can affect the FDI, and they can encourage or discourage firms to enter in the market. We will begin with talking about the how firms encourage, how governments encourage FDI. The first one, the key reason for firms may resist FDI is because the risk is involved. To minimize this concern, many countries have government-backed programs that cover a major. Okay, important thing is when firms are deciding, when firms intend to go out from domestic market to foreign market, there is, of course, they gonna calculate the risk. There are risks. This is the risky thing. Of course, there is a risk involved. How government encourage this sort of activity? They try to provide some sort of a government-backed insurance of such investments. This is the first way they can encourage. They are just encouraging firms to go out, just do it. And the second way is by providing them special loans, loans at the subsidized rate, and they can provide them some subsidies, tax rebates. This sort of things they can in those ways they can facilitate firms to go out from the domestic market. Formally, some countries have also developed special loan programs for companies investing in developing countries, created tax incentives, encourage host nations to relax their restriction on the. One another thing is they can government can talk with another government that provide some sort of facilities to this company, to my companies, and in that way a government negotiation can take place, and to encourage, these governments are encouraging FDI activity. The famous example is Toys R Us. Toys for Us. This is the toy making company of USA. They went to the Japan, and they did, in order to do so, to enter in the Japan, they have this is very famous. They have these 6 or 7 years lobbying to pursue the government, to the congressman, that they should talk with the Japan and to lift up some trade restrictions from Japan. And then they subsequently they achieved this their target, and they entered in the market, and they did really good in the Japanese market. On the other hand, there are governments who try to discourage the FDI. They don't want that firms go out from domestic to foreign market, and they want that firms should invest in their own countries. They shouldn't go out. How they do that? Countries regulate the amount of capital that can be taken out of the country. That can be the one way that they will not allow companies to take out of the capital from certain portion, more than certain portion. The next is the use tax incentive to keep investment at home. They can provide extra tax incentives, tax rebates if you are staying within the country. And they actually forbid investment in certain countries, like the USA has done for the companies trying to invest in Cuba and Iran. That can be another way. They directly suggest or forbid companies to do not go in those countries, and they can do this thing. This was the case for the home country. Home country encourage or discourage their companies. On the another perspective, we can see the host countries also encourage or discourage firms to enter in the market. How they encourage? The first one is, recall that we have moved away from the radical stance to discourage the FDI in general and towards the more. We have to keep this thing in mind, that the countries are moving away from the radical point of view to free market point of view. Free market is more strategy, is based on the strategy which encourage firm to come in the country to do the FDI. To encourage FDI, host countries usually offer incentives for investment like tax breaks, low interest loans or subsidies. Why would companies offer these benefits to foreign firms? That's an important question. But for instance, Kentucky, this is the state of US, one of the state of US, offered 112 million US dollars package to Toyota to get it to build its US plant in the state. Kentucky offered $112 million US package to Toyota that Toyota should build the production unit in Kentucky. Of course, this package includes all those elements like tax breaks and low interest loans and subsidies and this sort of things. But important point to say is, governments are encouraging firms to enter in the market. Okay, when a country wants to restrict the FDI in the opposite direction, like the radical point of view, it will usually implement ownership restraints and performance requirement. These are the two important tools, that are mechanism they use to restrict the companies to enter in the market. What's the meaning? Like in Sweden, for instance, very famous thing is, it's not allowed for foreign countries, foreign companies to enter in the tobacco industry. Similarly, in Finland, Finland and Norway, it's not allowed to invest in national resources for foreign companies. Similarly, US airline, in USA, it's prohibited to invest more than 25% in US airline industry. Ownership restraints accomplish two things. The first is, they keep foreign firms out of certain industries on the grounds of national security or competition along the local firms to develop. This is the first way they do that. They do not allow the foreign companies to enter in the market. They are just claiming that they want to protect the local industry. And the second thing is, they try to maximize the resource transfer effect, employment benefit that are associated with the FDI. This is the second element. In Japan, for instance, the early 1980s, most FDI was prohibited unless the foreign firms had valuable technology. This is a very important example, that in Japan in 1980s, there was a strict restriction for the FDI in Japan, and until you have a superior technology than Japanese technology, then you will be able to invest there. In order to get maximum resource transfer, means to get the maximum spillovers from that investment. Then the foreign firms were allowed to form a joint venture with the Japanese company. That's another. This is the continuation of they should have a better technology than Japanese. And the second thing is, they have to do the joint venture with the Japanese company. Through joint venture, what was the benefit of doing the joint venture? Because with the help of joint venture, the Japanese firms are going to learn the new advanced technology as well. And they believe that this would speed up the diffusion of technology throughout the Japanese economy. That's they are doing the business with collaboration of the foreign entrants to learn their technology. Okay, how do international institutions influence FDI? Before, we have seen how domestic country influence the domestic home country influence the FDI, host country influence the FDI, and now we are seeing how the international institutions like WTO, how these institutions affect the FDI. We have to keep in mind that besides the WTO, there are some other treaties, agreements as well, like SARC or NAFTA. These are the agreements, and these are the some between the regions, between the continents. through which this FDI is facilitated, like EU, Economic European Union, EAU. These are the different agreements that help, the international agreements that help FDI. Well, until recently there has not been any consistent involvement by multinational institutions on how FDI should be handled, but in 1995 the WTO got involved through its agreement on services. Remember that in order to sell services internationally, FDI is after not WTO was involved in FDI mainly because of service sector, because to provide the services in the foreign industry. These companies do not need to invest huge like in the foreign countries, in the foreign market, as they do in the manufacturing or other industries. So you might expect WTO is pushing for the liberalization of regulations governing FDI, like OEC. WTO is more forcing governments to liberalize their economies and liberalize their policies. Already agreements on the liberalization of telecommunication and financial services has been reached. Okay, what does it mean, the FDI, for the managers? Now we are going to see that when they have to do the decision of FDI, managers have to compare these things, like when they have to choose the FDI over merger or over license or over export. First, for instance, we know that exporting will be preferable to licensing. Exporting will be preferable to licensing as long as transportation costs and trade barriers are low. That's obvious thing. These are the two benefits associated with export. We also know that licensing isn't attractive when firm has know-how that a firm has know-how that cannot be properly protected by a licensing agreement, when the firm need to control over the foreign entity in order to maximize the profit, and when the firm's skill and capabilities are not amendable to licensing. When the firm observe this thing, that their knowledge, their competitive advantage lies in their management skill or their processes, and their marketing strategy or these sort of strategies or human capital. When they observe this thing, this sort of their competitive advantage, these positive elements, the strongholds will not be possible to replicate or reproduce by other companies in other markets through licensing. Then what they have to do, they have to choose the other mode. Other mode can be export. Export is only feasible when the cost of transportation is low and the trade barriers between those countries are very low. Then that can be the feasible mode of some international activity. But if the cost is high or there are trade barriers, then the FDI would be eventually the last opportunity, the last way and the mode of entry into the foreign market. In fact, licensing is going to be most likely in fragmented and low-tech industries where globally dispersed manufacturing isn't an alternative. When the licensing is more likely, more seen in fragmented and low technology industry. In high-tech sector, the licensing is not very common. For companies like McDonald's, which use the service industry version of licensing, McDonald's use a franchise mode, which is one sort of a licensing, and they are operating all over the globe. Finally, a government's policy towards FDI can be an important factor in decision about where to locate foreign production facility. That can be the important determining factor, that government policy towards FDI, the government policy of the host country and the home country, especially the host country, is very determining factor that firm decides about the location. Should they go and where to locate foreign production facilities. Clearly, firm will prefer to establish operation in countries with permissive attitude towards FDI, like the USA, more friendly environment. If the countries have the friendly environment, the companies will prefer to go in those markets. Firms may be able to negotiate with foreign governments and receive favorable terms for their investment, like Toyota did when it went in Kentucky. Firms may be able to negotiate with the foreign governments and receive favor. When their firms are trying to go out in the foreign market, they can negotiate their position, they can negotiate their things, their terms and conditions with the host market, with the host government, and like the Kentucky offered the facilities to the Toyota. This is the just a trade flow information flow diagram, that how managers make the decisions about FDI or export or import. It starts with the first one, the how high are the transportation costs and tariffs. This is the basic element for deciding the export decision. If it's low, then companies have to go for the export one, and if it's high, then they have to think another mode. And then the second question then they have to think is in know-how amenable to the licensing. If no, if if the technology is high, their competitive skill lies in the high technology or in management skill, then of course they cannot do the licensing. They have to do, if answer is no, they have to do the licensing. Otherwise, if answer is yes, then they have to think the next question. Is tight control over the foreign operation required? If there is really tight control and monitoring is required for the foreign operations, yes, then even then they cannot go for the licensing. If no, then they have to answer, they have to think about the next question, that can know-how be protected by the licensing contract, otherwise they're going to steal your technology. If yes, then they have to do that licensing mode, otherwise they have to go for the FDI mode. Okay, this is the mini case of FDI in Russia. This is the case which is provided in your book. In your book, it is already given that a small case study of it's provided in the 6th chapter of FDI, foreign direct investment, of book Hill, and the main important points. These are the 4 points we have discussed. I have mentioned here are as follows. After 5 years of launching reforms, Russia was still experiencing unprecedented capital flight. Capital was going out of the country. In 1996, some $22.3 billion left the country, and only $2.2 billion came in the country. You can see that to what extent they are experiencing the current account deficit. Russian FDI was only 5.3 billion, and comparatively in Hungary, which was a really small country, and they were receiving 11.5 billion in Hungary. You can see the difference across the countries. And Hungary was also as a liberated, and the Eastern Bloc, which was liberated after the collapse of the USA. They liberated from the influence of the Soviet or communist influence. Reasons was tax codes, weak and untrusted property and contract safeguards, regulations, privatization laws, bad privatization laws, less rule of law, no institutional support. These were the reasons that companies were not going into Russia. In an attempt to generate capital, they did privatize many state-run organizations. That was one attempt they did that to generate some capital, but they couldn't do it because even in the privatization they were failed, and they didn't allow the foreign entrants to bid in the privatization of state-owned organizations. In 1997, Yeltsin allowed FDI in oil and gas industry. Shell and Royal Dutch attempted to bid for Rosneft, which is a Russian oil and gas company. BP tried to buy a 10% of share in Sedyanko, and it was estimated to create 550,000 jobs and $450 billion revenue of capital. That was the first largest attempt of Russian government to invite or to do the FDI activity within Russia. The discussion questions that you have to think about are as follows. What are the benefits to the Russian economy from FDI in general and oil and gas industry in particular? What sort of advantages this Russian government is getting from this FDI, and what sort of benefits this oil and gas industry is getting from this FDI? The next question that you have to think is, can firms reduce the risk associated with Russian economy? The firms that are entering in the Russian economy, can they reduce the risk associated with the different sort of risk which we have mentioned in the second point? Can they reduce this sort of or minimize this sort of risks? You have to think about these risks. The certain elements are discussed in this case study. You can read that case study in more detail and you can find these answers. Okay, now we are going to do the summary of today's lecture. The first point that we had discussed is the host country benefits, and these are the 4 benefits. The resource transfer effects, that's the first benefit. The second one is the FDI brings to the host country bring jobs. FDI help in balance of payment in 2 ways. It brings substitute for import of goods with the FDI, and when multinational companies export product to other countries, that's in second way they impact positively on balance of payment. And FDI affects competition and economic growth. This is the third way. FDI increases the competition. Because of competition, the technology efficiency and the motivation for the domestic industries, domestic companies to invest more, to introduce or improve their quality will be higher. And all these elements ultimately affect positively on the economic growth. Okay, how this FDI affects negatively on the host country? The first one is adverse effect on the competition. It increases the competition and it kills the infant industry. The negative effect on the balance of payment. It can affect negatively on the balance of payment. And loss of national control. This is the third impact that these firms that countries get, the host country gets because of the because of FDI. They lose the control on the economy. Okay, when we talk about the effect on the home country, the effect on the capital account of the home country balance of payment. Of course, the capital is going out of the country. That's a negative effect on the balance of payment. The home country balance of payment effect. Also, the second thing is employment is going out of the country as well. Then the third point, the next point is, well, there are various ways the home country and host country can encourage and discourage ownership, this FDI. In fact, to encourage, they provide them subsidies, they provide them some special insurance, some special loan, discounted rates. These sort of things they are going to provide to encourage the FDI. To discourage, they can provide them mostly discourage through the ownership restraints and the performance restraints. These are the 2 mainly ways. And they claim that they try to protect the domestic industry. These are the claims that they use to discourage the foreign investment to enter in the country. The last topic that we had done is the decision to export license FDI. Managers have to consider the importing decision or a licensing or FDI decision at what point, what sort of decisions they have to make when they do the export and when they do the license and when they do the FDI. If there is trade barriers is high or the cost of production, cost of transportation is high, then they cannot go for export. If there is high tech sector is involved and where the strong monitoring is required, then or their competitive advantage lies in their management skill and process skill, then they cannot do the licensing. If they cannot follow these 2 modes, then they have left with the FDI mode of investment. This was the lecture for today. Thank you for today. Allah Hafiz.